Oh, okay, we're live. Hello, everyone. So I'm here with the one and only Apologetics Squared. There are other squares on the planet, but none of them are actively involved in apologetics.
Yeah.
Uh, I had an argument called the Anthropic argument for theism, which I've talked about at some length. The basic idea is that the right theory of anthropics, which is how to reason about your own existence, tells you that you should think that more people exist, and then, or specifically, that you get infinitely strong evidence that the number of people that exist is the most that there could be. And then the idea is that, theism is a better explanation of that fact than the atheistic worldview. And so as a result, this overall favors theism. Some fellow called Truth Teller wrote a response to this argument. I wrote another response, and then he wrote a roughly like 40,000 word response or something. It was about a book length. I mean, a pretty short book. But I was thinking of writing a reply, but I realized, I have better uses of 20 hours. So, I decided it would just be better to just do a YouTube stream talking about this. And I brought my favorite square evolved in apologetics to sort of walk through it, because he's also a proponent of the anthropic argument. And unlike me, he knows something about set theory. So, I should link to your channel. I forgot to do that.
Oh, okay.
He has a YouTube channel where he talks about apologetics arguments. Interesting guy. Do you want to tell people who you are if people are living under a rock and don't know who you are?
I make animated videos about apologetics. The arguments I tend to focus on are a little bit more esoteric, like the for example, the psychophysical harmony argument. Although I got comments that that argument isn't actually all that esoteric anymore, so mission accomplished there. But yeah, that's kind of what I do. I try to make animated videos explaining some of the more unique arguments in the philosophy of religion, stuff that interests me, arguments for theism and Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, don't you know that the psychophysical harmony argument is just one of those arguments from incredulity against evolution? So nothing new. Okay, so should we start reviewing?
Sure.
I guess maybe we could. Yeah, I could could share the article.
I have not read this article. I do know it starts with like a criticism that so for those of you who don't know, there's been a back and forth here. So my understanding is it started with Matthew invited Truth Teller onto his YouTube channel, and they had a discussion, but Truth Teller's like, I have more to say about this. So he wrote a blog post. Then Matthew responded to that blog post, and then Truth Teller is responding to that response. Do I have the timeline right?
Yeah. I responded the next day. This is something that Truth Teller is very mad about, that I didn't take like 5 days to respond, to show how seriously I took the challenge.
What I would say is like, yeah, I understand, wanting, like, Truth Teller obviously puts a lot of effort into his blog post, so it makes sense that he'd want like effort put into like people responding to it. And like Truth Teller, if you're watching, I like to say like I recognize that, but I just physically, like, the way my life is scheduled right now, I don't have time to go through this. This is the best I could offer you, like a kind of live reaction to these arguments.
Yeah, right. And like, yeah, I mean, it's true, I can understand why it would be a bit frustrating for the response to be to come out the next day, But I mean, it was like a 10,000 word response or something. It wasn't like, I was, firing off quickly, 500 words about why it was dumb. It was pretty comprehensive. I spent a lot of hours on it. And I mean, and they were mostly all the objections except the set theoretic misunderstandings, allegedly. There weren't any set theoretic misunderstandings, as we'll see, were, they were like things I'd already thought about. And so I was just saying things that I'd sort of already thought of. So it wasn't like, but yeah, anyways. But so truth teller, you begin, or sorry, good.
I was just to say large classes of these objections like get grouped under an umbrella, like for example, you thought that the one objection you had is that things that aren't supposed to be objections to the SIA actually were just objections to the SIA. So large portions of the objections would you viewed as all falling under the same category, which would have also presumably sped up the response process.
Right. Okay, so I guess, yeah, so let's begin with the alleged misunderstandings of set theory. So truth teller in his article originally said, he said the claim that the number of things, he says that the idea that there's a number of things too large to be a set is not at all true. It's completely false. It's BS.
Can I cut in to kind of set up where we are and why this even matters? Why are we talking about there being more things that are sets?
Yeah, that would be good.
Yeah, so the Anthropic argument leads to you thinking that there are more people rather than fewer people. Like the idea is if there were a Googleplex people in existence, that better predicts your existence than if there were only 10 people in existence. So when you update on, hey, I exist, well, that's actually evidence that there are Googleplex people rather than 10. Okay, but what if we take this reasoning to infinities? Like, would this be evidence that there are infinity people rather than a Googleplex people? Yes. In fact, what this argument says is that there's infinite evidence that there's Googleplex people, infinite evidence that there's infinity people rather than some finite number like Googleplex. Okay, though, now we get into this weird problem because there's actually different sizes of infinities, like a hierarchy of infinities in set theory. You have Beth 0, Beth 1, Beth 2, and so on. And so you have this infinite hierarchy of infinities. So in set theory, so the idea is that this argument would support Beth 2 people rather than Beth 1 people, and Beth 3 people rather than Beth 2 people. If there's like a qualification there that you have to accept a particular form of the unrestricted self-indication assumption for this sort of reasoning to take effect. But the idea is once you have this reasoning, then where this argument might lead, if depending on how this certain discussions go about what sort of the way that the exact way that your existence updates and counts as evidence for more people, like the precise nature of how that happens might entail that there's that there are more people than there are even sets. Like there are more people beyond how many sets there are in set theory. Right. So now we're asking, now that there's a question of like, is that coherent? Because like, well, if it's not a well-defined set, then is it like an incoherent concept? So that's where we are. Okay.
So truth teller says, okay, so what I say is, so truth teller says it's incoherent to say that there's there are things too large to be sets. A set is just a kind of collection, and that's like saying it's so big that it's not a collection of any kind. What I say is that sets have a certain well-defined definition, right? They're a particular kind of collection. And furthermore, there are well agreed upon things that are too large to be sets. So let me give two examples. One of them is the class of all sets. So the class, it's a collection that contains all the sets. It's too big to be a set because for any set of any size, the class of all sets is bigger than that. It contains that set and a bigger set. And so the class of all sets is it's too big to be a set in that sense. And then the collection of all truths, that's too big to be a set, right? So imagine you thought that the collection of all truths was a set with cardinality Beth 5 or something. Well, so here's a fact about sets. If you take all the subsets of something, so all the subsets are all the different smaller sets you can get from rearranging them. So for example, the set the number 1 and the number 2, its subsets are the empty set, which has nothing, a set containing just 1, a set containing just 2, and the set containing 1, 2. If you take all the subsets, the set plus all the subsets will be a bigger set. Right. So if you take all the subsets of Beth1, you get Beth2. If you take all the subsets of Beth2, you get Beth3. But the point is, every subset of truths is itself a truth, right? So if it's true that A and it's true that B, then it's true that A, it's true that B, and it's true that A and B, right? And so there can't be, because you can construct another truth from every subset of truths, then it can't be the case that the cardinality of the collection of all truths has any as the size of any set. So the idea is that it's too big in this to be a set. And what we mean when we say too big to be a set is for any set of any size, you could make a bigger set just using part of the thing that's bigger than any set. Okay, so Truth Teller responds saying, BB, that's me, my blog's Bentham's Bulldog, replies by bringing up the notion of proper classes that are too large to be a set, citing Wikipedia. Unfortunately, as a response to what I said, this simply misunderstands the dialectical context. It is true that in set theory, there is something known as proper classes, such as the class of all sets or the class of all ordinals. BB's claim, however, was that there is a number of people too large to be a set. Proper classes, since they aren't sets, aren't actually a number of things. Okay, so the idea here is that, okay, maybe there are things that are larger than any set, but they're not a number of things. And I guess I would say about this, like, okay, this is just sort of quibbling over semantics. It depends on what you mean by number. But really what I was saying, maybe the word number, that was a bit imprecise. But really what I was saying was that the set was that, sorry, not the set. The collection of all people comprises a collection too large to be any set. So then Truth Teller, do you have anything to add to that Apologetics squared?
Well,
first name Apologetics, last name squared.
Let's go to the next sentence. Do you have something to say about that?
Yeah. Now, true enough, it is sometimes said that a proper class is too large to be a set, but it's important to be clear about what that means.
Oh, sorry, the sentence after.
What it does not mean is that there is any size S that denotes the size of the class of all sets, such that S is measurably greater than any in amount than C, where C is any arbitrary cardinal number.
Okay, so I think that this is a kind of a point that I'd push back against, in that size can mean something different in different contexts, right? Like if I gave you the set of all real numbers between 1 and 2, right? Let's say inclusive. What's the size of that set? I mean, there are different ways, like different things I could mean. I could mean that like the interval is what the size of the set is 1. You take the upper bound, subtract the lower bound, and you get that the size is 1. Or I could be talking about the cardinality of the set, right? The cardinality of the set is going to be Beth1, because you could make a function that maps every number between 2 and 1 to a distinct real number and vice versa. So size means different things in different contexts. If we mean by size cardinality, then of course we're going to get problems by saying that the size of all possible people is greater than any sets, because the notion of cardinality is a notion used for sets. So of course, if we're making the claim that the size of all possible people or all existing people is greater than any set, then we're not going to be using the notion of cardinality, because that's a notion that's reserved for sets, right?
Right. Yeah. It's a sort of weird criticism where it's like, you were talking about size bigger than a set, but that's incoherent, because sets don't have sizes bigger than sets if we use this thing used to measure the size of sets. But that's not what we're talking about. And in fact, in my article, I gave some kind of precise definition of what it means for something to be too big to be a set, which is for any set of any size, using only parts of a collection is too large to be a set. If for any set of any size, you can form a bigger set using only part of that collection. So that's true of the class of all sets. That's true of the collection of all truths, etc.
I think you could also use like an injection surjection sort of definition, which well, I guess I'm not sure. Well, maybe that would work. So I should say, like, this isn't something that I have any expertise on. I'm more of a hobbyist when it comes to set theory, set ideas, but I know enough to at least make some comments.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I talked to one of my friends who's informed about set theory about this, and he said this is a perfectly fine definition.
Yeah.
So he says, okay, this means that the axioms of set theory prevent us from treating them as sets, and they cannot participate in the same operations that sets do. This is to avoid various paradoxes. Right, so again, I wasn't claiming that, like, the point is it's not a set, but if the idea is that you can't, like, do any mathematical operations with them because they're not a set, I mean, I don't know why we would think that, right? Like, it's
Sorry.
just the point is just if you think more people existing is more likely, then if you have a number of people existing that's so mind-bogglingly enormous that it can't even be a set, or if you have a collection of people existing that's so mind-bogglingly enormous that it can't be set, well, that theory is going to be even better.
Can you go down to his footnote? Because he has a foot. Just do Control F and then like square bracket 1 square bracket. That's how I got to it. So his first footnote, it's he actually mentions that you can extend this notion of you could extend standard set theory to include classes, where it makes sense to say that they have a cardinality in some sense, but cardinality here isn't used in the conventional sense. They aren't assigned a cardinal number. And so what we would say is that, yeah, we're not trying to say that there is a conventional cardinal number for the all existing people. It'd be a very unconventional, or I guess it would be it would be beyond the standard set theory notion of cardinality. And the last sentence here, all that is really being said is that you can have an injective or surjective function that map elements between proper classes. And the idea is that, you can have an injective function that maps every set to a unique existing person, but you can't have an injection of all existing persons to a unique set. And I hope I'm using I always get injective and surjective and these things mixed up. But the idea is you can't map a unique set, or you can't take every set and map it to a unique. Shoot, I need 1 second. You can take every set and map it to a unique person, but you can't map every unique person to a distinct set. So in that sense, that's like the idea of the claim that there are more people than there are sets.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, so revisiting our topic. Okay, so then Truth Teller suggests maybe all possible people is intended to be a class. Well, I don't think it's a class, right? It's bigger than a class. So the idea is that it's, I think, like, and this gets into some weird territory, but I think it's maybe like there's certain collections that are too large to have any well-defined cardinality, like the collection of all truths.
Yeah.
And so I think it's like that size, where in some sense it's like there aren't any limits. What's his name? Some famous mathematician, was it Hilbert, talked about this as the absolute infinite, where it's like,
I think that was actually Cantor, but he had this idea. Yeah. He had this idea of the absolute infinity, and like, yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot. And okay, I've got real quick. So if we want to say that there's like an absolute infinity, it's like kind of like at the this sort of maximum infinity. That's kind of what the idea of an absolute infinity is. It's bigger than Beth 2 or Beth 78 or whatever. It's like this maxed out infinity. And what that would have to mean is that you can't take the power set of this kind of absolute infinity, because any power set of any power set of a collection yields a larger collection. So this would have to be like a collection which is too large to even take a power set of, which seems like a weird concept, because like, I mean, surely for like, if there was an absolute infinity of truths, well, surely I could just take any arbitrary subset of, or sub collection, to be more broad, a sub collection of truth, any arbitrary sub collection of truths, and make a new truth from that. And the more I thought about this, there's some paradoxes that might actually get you to doubt that sort of maneuver can be done. Like if we take like all non-self-referential propositions. You can't have a proposition about that's like the conjunction of all non-self-referential propositions, because either it will include itself or not. You get the same sort of Russell's paradox thing. So that sort of Russell's paradox applied to truths makes me think that maybe you can't take any arbitrary sub-collection of truths and make a new truth out of it. And then that would entail that that would motivate this idea that you can have an absolute infinity of truth, because you can't take the power set. Some collections of truths just can't form a new truth.
Yeah. And you should be suspicious about this idea that you could take the power set of the truths, and that it would be bigger than the truths, because just every subset of truths is itself a truth, right? So then you would get the result that the collection
there are more truths than truths,
right? Which seems false.
Yes.
Okay, so now, suppose Truth Teller says, maybe we're talking about all classes. No, I don't think it's a class, but okay, maybe these problems will apply to there being absolute infinite. Okay, so when BB states that all possible people is an amount, are we as a class? Okay, we talked about whether it's problematic to describe it as an amount. First, this would mean that the total number of individuals encompassed by all possible people is undefined, since proper classes aren't assigned any cardinal number, making any probability calculations concerning this group also undefined. Thus, if possible people is a proper class, calculations like probability of y given not t also become undefined, since there isn't any value we could assign to it, which would entail that probability of y given t is also undefined. Do you have anything to say about that?
So, like you said, I mean, there are ways of extending set theory to include the notion of a cardinality of a class. I'm not sure exactly why that would be undefined. Why? Sorry. Since proper classes are... Yeah, okay, so do we need to reference the cardinality of a class in order to make a probabilistic calculation of it? Like if I had a proper class of I don't know, a proper class of cards, like a deck of cards with a proper class many cards in the deck, and one of them was black and the rest were red, I think I could make, and like one is drawn at random, can I make it a probabilistic assessment of the probability that it would be red? Seems like I can, even if in standard Zermelo-Frankel set theory there is no cardinality of red cards.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, the other thing is like, there are other cases where there has to be some way of reasoning about this, even if the math gets a little bit weird, right? So for example, imagine that it turns out that, like, imagine you have, God creates some proper class worth of people, and then wakes up some number of them. Suppose you wake them up, or you wake up from this. Like, surely there's some sense in which you should think God woke up more people. Waking up more people is more likely. Which God waking up everyone is the most likely. In which God waking up like Beth 2 has a probability of 0, but it's in some sense maybe higher than Beth 1 or something. Like, there's got to be some sense in which this is coherent. But okay, anyways, so second, it probably implies that all possible people only exist as a theoretical construct, which suggests that it's incorrect to update in favor of a view that predicts all possible people when they couldn't exist. Well, is the collection of all truths a theoretical construct?
Maybe. What? I mean, if you're like a sort of like a deflationist about truth, then maybe you could say like there aren't like really truths. It's just like to say X is true, or to say X and Y is true isn't actually a new truth. It's just a way of like assenting, or like expressing that you believe X and expressing that you believe Y. I don't know. Maybe you could like say could do something like that.
Say that. But this, it just seems undermotivated. It's like, yeah, maybe if you have this weird view about truth, it's true. But just like, why think this? Like Truth teller is asserting this as if it's just like established fact, when it implies these really like this very deflationist view about truth.
Well, yeah, and I get that the idea of an absolute infinity, like that is like a bit of a controversial view. So I do want to reiterate for the audience. So this idea that this argument, the anthropic argument, takes you to an absolute infinity of people existing. Um, this is something that I'm interested in exploring, and I think Matthew is as well. But like, we could like take that off the table and like just focus on something like there being Beth two people, and whether that's more explained better on theism or naturalism. We could kind of table this discussion of absolute infinity for a while. There's like a way you could form the anthropic argument that in private messages, right? We've messaged about this, and like you came up with a formulation that can like kind of sidestep this whole discussion of absolute infinities, right? So the argument doesn't rest on this. This is more just of a question of like, does this formulation, or this is a question of like, does this actually support absolute infinity? Like, it's more of a curiosity, I would say, almost, because it's orthogonal to the actual success of the argument.
Right. And also, I mean, as we'll see, like, I think the primary reason to think that there are absolute infinite people and that there's got to be some way of making sense of this is just this is what I think the most plausible version of SIA implies, as we'll talk about later. So like, if you accept this sort of like the arguments for this kind of SIA, then you basically have to think that there are both absolute infinite possible and actual people, where like it's not like this is just some unmotivated thing that like the argument might commit you to. It's that the argument gives you an active reason to accept it, at least if you buy certain assumptions. But the argument doesn't need it. There are just certain assumptions on which it might be true. So okay. Okay, so now Truth Teller says, you know, there's no such thing as all truths on pain of contradictions. And there's a paper by Patrick Grimm where Grimm is raising a problem for omniscience and says, look, you know, with omniscience, you can't be omniscient if you, you know, if we're omniscient, there would be a set of all your knowledge, but there's not a set of all truths. And so therefore you can't be omniscient. In response, Plantinga says, you know, why do the things that God knows have to be a set? And so I say, Truth Teller cites the Grimm proof. But again, I don't think the Grimm proof shows that there's no such thing as all the truths. It just shows that all the truths don't form a set. So Truth Teller admits, of all the responses, this one is admittedly somewhat fair. I'll take it. One possible way of attempting to preserve all truths might be to deny that all truths is a set-like object. This is Plantinga's rejoinder. However, Grimm doesn't think that works, and in fact explicitly does take his proof to apply to any class or a collection of all truths. I think that something like the Cantorian argument can be constructed against any class, collection, or totality of all truths. Such an argument can be constructed without any explicit use of the notion of membership. Right, okay, but we talked about that before, right? Where it's like this assumes that there are, you know, this would imply that there are more truths than there are,
So I mean, I haven't read this paper. I'm going to be completely upfront about it. Maybe he has some argument that I haven't heard of, but I very much doubt that such a project could work, because you have to walk this sort of fine line between saying like, okay, we have this notion of truth that if you we have this notion of truth that we can't do like set like operations to, otherwise you get like paradoxes like there are more sets than there are more truths than there are truths. So we need to be comfortable with there being truths and not being able to do these sort of set like operations to them. But God's knowledge, for some reason, adding having the exact same things, the truths, but including like God knows ... before each of these truths, that somehow is problematic structurally. It's like I very much doubt it. It's just going to be like the same sorts of things structurally speaking. So if like one is a problematic infinity, then so is the other. I also think there are like other models of God's omniscience that just bypass this
Right.
problem, like where it's like God has just an intuitive grasp of everything, in which case God's knowledge actually can't be collected literally in this sort of way. So I'm not even that worried about it, even if it is correct.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, so I think we addressed that. So the idea is that, so Trudeauer says, the idea is the problem doesn't arise from the nature of sets, but from the fact that the properties need to describe all truths, among which would be referential properties cannot be fully captured in a contradiction-free manner. So I think the idea is supposed to be that you can't have like a collection of all truths, because if you did, then you could take the power set of the collection or something, and then the collection would be bigger than it is. But yeah, I just take this to be a reason to deny that you can coherently power set the set to get more truths.
Oh, and it's just like use plural quantification. Okay, so plural quantification, I kind of feel like it's like trying. I'm really skeptical of plural quantification personally. It kind of looks to me like a way of trying to sneak in notions of set theoretic operations while pretending that you aren't actually committing yourself to anything ontological. Apparently, there are like this is a thing that philosophers do they use plural quantification to be able to invoke like these set theoretic kind of concepts without committing themselves to any substantive view on set theory or any sort of related topic. I'm a little, when I see plural quantification, I get skeptical. That's just me.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that probably wasn't very clear, but I think that plural quantification is this sort of model used by philosophers to try and sneak in assumptions about how you can collect objects together without doing the work to show that such collections are possible.
Yeah. Okay, so then BB also addresses my argument that if it were true that all possible people is too large to be a set, and by parity of reasoning, we can argue this implies that God can't create all possible people. Oh, should I? He doesn't say what his argument is or what the premises are. Oh, that's annoying. Okay, I guess
I think that.
Is it above?
No, I remember it though. I just remember it because it's what I've been thinking of. It's the main problem with an absolute infinity of people. It's that, well, you could just take the power set of it. And he goes with like this idea of take any arbitrary collection of existing or possible people. You could have a person thinking about that collection of people, and so in that way, that's like a distinct possible person, and so in that way you can construct the power set of all possible people.
Yeah. Yeah. So the idea, right? So the idea is that so I say one reason to think that the collection of possible people is too big to be a set is that it seems like for every truth, there's a possible person who thinks that truth. And then the idea is that, or sorry, for any set of any size, it seems like a possible person could think about that set. You could create a distinct possible person who thinks about that set, which means that the number of possible people is too big to be a set.
Yeah.
So truth teller argues there are 7 premises. So first, suppose there's some God actualizable state of affairs A wherein all possible people are made to exist, assumed for reductio. 2, we can perform an operation parallel to forming the power set of a set, in which we form a collection of every conceivable world segment of A, e.g. the world segment that just has Billy, the world segment that has Billy and Sandra, the one that just has Sandra, the one that has Sandra and Joe and Ethan. Call this collection A. So yeah, I would just reject that because I don't think once you have the collection of all possible people, you can't make more people, right? So you couldn't actually construct all those world segments.
Yeah, or all those world segments would already be contained within A, right?
Right. Yeah. And so then they say, or then he says, there is a unique possible mind that individually thinks about a proposition pertaining to some distinct element of PA, where a set of such minds would have cardinality equal to PA. But I reject that as well because I think that only applies to sets.
So what I would say that there is, okay, so I think that this is where absolute infinities get weird. It's because of this idea that if there's an absolute infinity of things, then I need to be very explicit about, because this is kind of weird, but it's where an absolute infinity leads. There have to be things that can't be collected together in the same way everything else can. An analogy might be with truths. If I said all propositions which are not about themselves are not about themselves, that sounds like a true thing, right? That sounds just like a tautology. But then now I can ask you, hey, is that proposition about itself? Well, it's only about those propositions which are not about themselves. So it's about itself if and only if it's not about itself. So you could like perform Russell's paradox with truths, right? And so the idea is like, oh, maybe there are like truths that can't be collected in this way. You can't like actually collect all the truths which are not about themselves and then into a new truth. And if we say there's an absolute infinity of people, we do have to say something similar. Like there is going to be like there is no way to there is no such thing as a thought about all the persons who are not thinking about themselves, and there is no proposition about all persons who are thinking about propositions which are not about themselves, and that sort of thing. And so like if there is an absolute infinity, if this concept is coherent, then it's this sort of infinity that that's so large, it's in a sense impossible to even collect certain subsets of it. Like there are or I'm not even sure if you can coherently refer to these sort of subsets. So
yeah.
I think that
Yeah.
that is a weird concept. That's kind of like the oddity of absolute infinity, that it has
Yeah, it
like,
might be a bit weird, but I don't know. Once you realize that it contains all the subsets, then trying to like take the subsets and do other things with them and argue they're bigger starts to get weird. But anyways,
yeah.
yeah.
And so
Okay,
maybe, yes. So absolute infinities, they entail that you can't do normal sorts of collection procedures, which, real quick, why is that a problem? Because, well, I guess in set theory, we have an axiom that says you are allowed to do that. But I mean, this isn't the collection of all possible people isn't a set. So I'm not actually like, the more I think about it, the more I think this is odd. It's not how we normally think about collections, because with normal collection, like with sets and classes and all these things, we do have this kind of intuition that, yeah, these are just mathematical collections. Can't we just take every subset sort of or an arbitrary collection of elements that are contained in the set and form a new set out of that? But no, absolute infinity is not like that. And the more I think about it, I think that it's coherent to say that, yeah, no, an absolute infinity, you just can't perform that operation with.
yeah,
This is
yeah.
a very,
I find all this kind of confusing as
yes,
and yeah, it is confusing. But I guess I mean the way I think about it is just like, so we have good reason to think SIA is right. SIA says more people existing is more likely, specifically a theory that says there are n times more people is n times more likely. From that, your credence in there being an infinite of any size that's not the biggest is 0, right? So then, from that, okay, maybe the end result's going to be weirder, but like the alternative is just either rejecting SIA, which for reasons I'll explain, I don't think you should do, or like just having this like really weird view where you think SIA is true, but then just for some reason, like not every person exists, like that we just happen to get lucky and hit a 0% probability event when there's another theory on which stuff's a bit weird, but it wouldn't be 0% probability.
Yeah. And I think that most of the motivation is that, like, with normal sets, so here's a good, maybe this is would kind of clarify what I'm getting at. So take the natural numbers, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. If I there are going to, the axioms of set theory, like standard set theory, are going to guarantee that any combination of numbers as a subset also exists within set theory. So the prime numbers, the even numbers, or just a string of digits, a string of numbers, 2, 3, 7, a googolplex, 4 times a googolplex, and so on. Just like following no pattern or anything, just going on forever, including random numbers, every sort of combination of the natural numbers also exists in a set, right? And does that make sense? Every combination, whether or not you can think about it, of natural numbers also exists as a set.
Yeah.
You follow? You follow? Okay. So then the idea is that for an absolute infinity to exist, you can't do that. There's going to be like these sort of unthinkably infinitely large patternless sets of people that you can't actually do anything to collect together.
Yeah.
Which is So, and I mean that means that it's a weird sort of collection, and I'm fine with that. I'm fine with saying that the number of people that exists is weird and doesn't follow our notion of Zermelo-Frankel set theory.
Yeah, and I don't think that this should be that surprising. Where it's like, think about how much weirder infinite is than finite. And then this is like a new kind of infinity that's like where in some other sense, like all infinites are nothing compared to it, where like it's like categorically beyond the other infinites. Like, wouldn't we expect that to have a bunch of weird properties? But so yeah. Okay, so then Truth Teller says, so I said I reject 2 because Cantor's theorem only applies to sets, and there are unsettly many world segments. And I reject 3. Wait, sorry, what?
Technically, Cantor's theorem doesn't just apply to sets; it applies to it could apply to classes as well, and anything, any of these sorts of things. It just to make it not apply to absolute infinities, you have to do this sort of rejection that any arbitrary sub collection of also exists just by fiat.
Yeah, I guess, and I haven't looked into it that carefully, but maybe I would think maybe like Cantor's theorem doesn't apply to the absolute infinite. Maybe there's some other way of getting around it, but I'd have to look more into that.
I have thought about this, and I think that's pretty much the only way to get around it, I think.
Okay. Yeah. So it's true that Cantor's theorem applies to sets, but if B thinks this means that 2 is false, then he hasn't tracked the argument. The context of the argument, taking every world segment of a state of affairs so stipulated as an operation that is parallel to taking every possible subset of a set. Simply by stipulation, every world segment of A can be put in one-to-one correspondence with the set of all possible world segments of A, PA. If A is a possible state of affairs, then there's nothing to stop us from forming a set that contains all possible world segments of A as elements. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what he's saying here does rebut what you're saying. I think that that's what he's saying there is fair enough. It's just I would reject that you can actually form P of A. I would say that the power set of an absolute infinity isn't formable in principle.
Yeah. Right. So okay, yeah. So his rejection of 3 would undermine his own argument that there's no set of all minds. In laying out the argument, I assume for reductio that there's a state of affairs with all possible minds, and then show that this assumption entails a contradiction in exactly the same way that he allegedly proves that a set of all minds entails a contradiction. Here's a parody of his response that undermines his own argument against there being a set of all minds. Once you have a set of all minds, then you can't have new ones to think about things. So you can't have new minds thinking about each element of the power set of the set of all minds. If BB's response to 3 is sound, then he should think his own argument, there isn't a set of all minds, is a failure. I don't know. I mean, it seems kind of like I don't have any intuitions about whether once you make all minds, by definition, you can't have new minds thinking about those minds. But I do have the intuition that just for any set, then you could just have a mind that thinks about that set. So, but yeah, I mean, it just does seem question begging where it's like, if you think there's a collection, you can create all minds, then by definition, you can't make more minds after that. Okay, so now moving on. Or do you have any final words on that?
Nope. No, we can move on. This is all the weird high-level set theory stuff. There is a wasp flying around my room, so if I randomly mute and then stop responding, it's because I'm in a death battle.
I see. And if suddenly we hear from your end, well, what we should really be thinking about is the wasp indication assumption. That means the wasp has taken over.
Is that your impression of me?
No, that was my impression of a wasp.
Oh, okay.
No, I could do my impression of you.
Yeah.
Well, I think I did before, but I'll do it. Hello there. So I was recently reading about Chris Mendel's argument from sets. Blah blah blah, etc. I don't know that much to say. Okay, infinites and the self-indication assumption. What we've talked about so far is very weird. Now it'll get less weird, though still a bit weird. Okay, so none of the above is actually all that important to the anthropic argument for theism itself, as BB himself correctly notes. That's meat. So let's get to the meat now. The first objection I make is that the anthropic argument is that updating in favor of a scenario or hypotheses that entail more observers is not that straightforward in the case where the total class of observers is infinite. In fact, it appears that such an inference does not go through. BB starts by claiming the following. Right, so the idea of SIA is that more people existing is more likely. So that's sort of what I say. It says nothing about the percent of possible people existing. And so, yeah. Okay, so Truth Teller says, BB's response, BB claims my objection. Okay, so just for those who are confused, the basic idea seems to be that that maybe this all works in the finite case, right? So maybe thinking that if there were like maybe it's perfectly, imagine there were 100,000 possible people, right? Maybe you should think that all 100,000 people exist because that makes it likelier that you would exist. But once there are infinite people, this all goes out the window. And I mean, so my first problem with this, and sort of this is what I discuss, is that if you think that this goes out the window, then you have no theory of anthropics, because there are obviously not a finite number of people. Like, if you think there are a finite number of possible people, because the number of actual people can't be more than the number of possible people, then you have to think that we can just a priori rule out the universe being infinite in size, because we'd run out of souls or something, which is very silly. So yeah, right. So then this is just not the self-indication assumption. And then all the arguments for the self-indication assumption are against that. So BB claims that my objection, that in the case where the universal class of observers is infinite cardinality, there's no reason to update in favor of hypotheses which posit more observers, is really just an objection to the SIA itself. And then any argument for the SIA would be an argument against that claim. This would be big if true, but unfortunately it's false. There are two principles here which BB is implicitly conflating. One more modest one, which is the SIA is standardly understood, Nick Bostrom's formulation. Another is a much stronger one, what I'll call the NSIA. Well, so I guess before we go on, I can just describe, let me go through three arguments for SIA and then describe how they all say, they all work just as well if the collection of people is infinite. Okay, so here's what I think is the best argument for SIA. So imagine you have two theories. One theory says there are more people. Okay, so imagine a person gets created, they'll flip a coin. If it comes up heads, more people get created. Okay. So on SIA, if you get created and you don't know if you're the first person, you should, and by the way, I just got a paper that is to be published, but it got accepted for publication, arguing for this. So a person gets created. If they flip a coin, if it comes up heads, a second person gets created. Or let's say 10, or let's say 3 other people get created. Okay, so you suppose you're created and you don't know your birth rank. Your credence on SIA in the coin coming up heads should be 80%, because heads means the 3 extra people get created. Tails means they don't. So, right, so you think of the possible people that could be created, 4 of them get created if it's heads and only 1 of tails. Okay, then suppose you find out that you're the first person. Well, now on SIA, the odds of you being the first person are 1 in 4. So now you started out with 4 to 1 odds, and then you decrease it by 4 to 1 odds. So now you're back to 50% odds. So now the coin that you haven't flipped that'll create people if it comes up heads, you're 50-50 on whether it will come up tails. If you don't accept SIA, then you start out indifferent between those two hypotheses. And so if you start out indifferent between the two hypotheses, and then you find out that you're the first person, being the first person, that's only 20% chance, 25% chance if the coin came up came up tails, while it's 100% chance if the coin came up heads. So now, or sorry, other way around, 25% chance if it came up heads, 100% chance if the coin came up tails. So now you have 4-to-1 odds that the coin that hasn't been flipped yet will come up heads based on the fact that if it, or will come up tails based on the fact that if it comes up heads, you'll have a bunch of kids. So that's I think the best argument for SIA. Now that just applies to the infinite case. Okay, so imagine there are Aleph null people that get created, then a coin gets flipped, and if it comes up heads, Beth 1 new people get created. You get created. On SIA, you should have a credence of 1 that the coin came up tails. And then, updating based on the fact that the coin came up, then if you find out that you're one of the first Aleph null people, because the odds of that are 0 on the other hypothesis, then you're back to 50-50. In contrast, on SSA, now after finding out you're one of the first Aleph null people, now you're 100% sure that the coin will come up heads, because if it came up the odds conditional on the coin coming up tails, that you'd be one of the first Aleph null people, or 0, right? So, oh, you were gone. Okay, but you're back now. Cool. Hope you won your battle with the wasp.
I hit it like 4 times with a shirt, and it didn't even seem to notice, and eventually I just let it out a window. So sorry. Keep talking about important philosophy stuff.
Yeah. So the idea is that this does apply just as much to SIA, but just restricted to finite cases. And it would be really weird if SIA just went out the window when applied to finite cases. Like, it would be very strange if, like, more people existing is more likely, but when you get to infinite, that magically reverses for no reason. And the sort of motivation where it's like more people existing makes my existence more likely is very mysterious. A second argument for SIA is, and this I also have a paper on, the idea is that, so imagine, okay, here's a plausible principle. You exist gives you evidence that your parents didn't use effective contraception. Seems right. Okay, so now let's imagine that there were 1 million people, and they all flipped a coin. And if the coin came up heads, none of them used effective contraception, making it so that they each, all 1 million of them were going to have sex. And if the coin came up heads, none of them used effective contraception. And let's imagine that sex without effective contraception guarantees pregnancy. So all of them would have gotten pregnant. In contrast, if the coin came up tails, they would have used very effective contraception with 1 in a million failure rate, so only 1 person would have come to exist. You come to exist. I claim you get very strong evidence that the coin came up heads, because if the coin came up heads, the odds of your mother getting pregnant are 100%, and it's 1 in a million if the coin came up tails. So I think your credence in the coin having come up heads should be 1,000,000 to 1. Okay, and then let's imagine instead of 1 million people each having sex, instead it's 1 person having sex 1 million times. Before they do it, they flip a coin. If it comes up heads, they don't use any contraception. If it comes up tails, they use effective contraception each time. With a 1 in a million failure rate. I claim for the same reason that your credence in the coin coming up heads, if you get created, should be 1 million times your credence in the coin coming up tails, because the odds you'd be created on that your mother would get pregnant on that particular sex act are 100% if the coin comes up heads, and 1 in a million if the coin came up tails. And then the last case is just God flips a coin. If heads, he creates 1 million people. If tails, he creates 1 person. I claim that's like the case before, but with just 1 million people. It's like the case before. The only difference is how he creates the people is different, but surely that shouldn't be relevant. Again, the same argument, you can make it with infinite people. So you can imagine that there are Aleph null people, and each of them are going to have either 1 kid or Beth 1 kids. Like, no, sorry, you'd imagine there were Beth 1 people, and then either Aleph null of them have kids or all of them have kids. You existing gives you evidence that all of them had kids, because that means the odds that your mother would become pregnant are 100% rather than 0%. And so same principle applies there. And then the last argument that can also be applied in infinite cases, and this one is one I find most convincing, is this argument's given by Elga in one of the first papers on Sleeping Beauty problem. The idea is just, Okay, imagine a coin gets flipped. If it comes up tails, if it comes up heads, John gets created. If it comes up tails, John and Jack get created. Well, let's see what my credences should be. Well, my credence in the coin having come up heads and me being John should equal my credence in me being the coin having come up tails and me being John. Both of them predict that John would get created, right? They both predict the event with certainty. So if I found out that I was John, I should be indifferent between those two hypotheses. And then my credence in tails and I'm Jack equals my credence in tails and I'm John. And so then the credence is split 3 ways. Again, same argument can be made in the infinite case, right? So if one hypothesis is that there are Aleph null people and one hypothesis is that there are Beth 1 people, well, imagine, what's your credence in being any of the first Aleph null people on H1 equals your credence in being one of the first Aleph null people on H2. And so same reasoning tells you that that you should think that there are higher numbers of infinite, right? So this just is rejecting SIA. And in particular, it would be very weird to think that SIA worked for finite numbers, but stopped working for infinite numbers. And if you did think that, then you would get this very strange result where your existence is a 0 probability event. Because if you're reasoning as if you're randomly drawn from all people, but but thinking there are infinite people doesn't explain your existence, it's just more finite people is likelier, well, then your existence is 0% probability event because it's a finite number over an infinite number. Okay. Anything you have to add, Mr. Square?
Nope. Right now, so I was briefly occupied. You were just giving us the motivations for the SIA, or what?
I was giving motivations for SIA, and I was explaining how those motivations mean SIA doesn't just apply in finite cases, but applies in infinite cases.
Okay, yeah, and did you have those little diagrams I made?
Oh, no. I mean, I think you sent them to me, but
over Messenger.
I could pull them up. You could share your screen, I guess.
Shoot. I do not actually have them right now. Sorry.
Can you access the versions you sent me?
No, actually, I did it on a different computer, and this one isn't logged into Messenger. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay, no worries.
Anyways, anyways, that's just for when we get to the NSIA part. That's kind of why I made all those little diagrams to explain why I think that you can't accept the SIA the way he phrases it without also accepting the NSIA as he phrases it, which be more clear when we get to that section what I mean.
So Truth Teller says this is going to be one of the recurring themes in Bentham's Bulldog's response. BB claims that my objection that the case where the class of observers is an infinite cardinality, there's no reason to update in favor of hypotheses which posit more observers, is really just an objection to the SIA itself. That any argument for the SIA would be an argument against that claim. This would be big if true, but unfortunately, it's false. There are two principles here which BB is implicitly conflating. One is a more modest one, which as the SIA is commonly understood, Nick Bostrom's formulation. Another is a much stronger one. What I will call the NSIA, standard SIA, is as follows. All other things equal, an observer should reason as if they're randomly selected from the set of all possible observers. Yeah, so I think that's how Bostrom formulates it, but I think that's a bad formulation because, one, it assumes that the collection of observers is a set, which I think those who accept SIA should reject. And then, it does just, I think, commit you to the more restricted self-indication assumption. I think a better way is my formulation, where the idea is just a theory that says there are more people, more people who you currently might be, that predicts n times as many of those, explains your existence n times as well. And maybe that stops working in infinite cases or whatever, but yeah, it's a little bit tricky to give a particularly precise formulation. But as I was explaining,
I might be able to. If we might be able to say that. Because if we conditionalize on two hypotheses, H1 and H2, then and that we give them No, I need to work out the math because like when I was working it out later, I made a bunch of idealizations like H1 and H2 have the same starting prior probabilities and all that. So that might never mind. Yeah, but I think what you could do is you could say basically you get an n times update in finite cases, and then if H1 and H2, one says H1 is an infinite cardinality that's greater than the number of people in H2, then conditionalizing on the disjunction of H1 or H2 would entail that you should have a credence of 1 in H1 and a credence of 0 in H2.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of describing it. Okay, so there are two principles. Okay, so SIA is you reason as you're randomly selected from the set of all possible observers. I guess I reject that, right? Because I don't think all observers is set.
Yeah.
But if you do that, I think the argument can work perfectly fine because we have independent reason to think that the cardinality of observers is at least Beth2. And the argument can work totally fine, just saying, okay, there are Beth2 people, SIA instructs you to think. That's better explained by theism, right? Okay, so okay, basically you should reason as if you are a member of a universal class of all possible observers, each of which are equally likely to exist. This entails that all else equal, hypotheses or scenarios. I don't know why there's an apostrophe after the O in scenarios. It's not possessed by the scenario. Anyways, on which there are more observers are more likely conditional on your existence. Because of the observers that could exist, there's a larger share of the observers that do exist. Higher chance of you to be among the observers that instantiated. Here's the much stronger claim that BB appears to be endorsing. NSIA, necessarily if a hypothesis H1 posits n times as many observers as H2, then upon updating on your existence, you ought to think X is n times more likely than H2. Well, not, okay, that I would obviously not endorse that, right? Because there could be other relevant evidence. Like if one theory says there are two people, one theory says, right, but it predicts your existence n times as well, which, yeah. So I would endorse that. But remember, that's a stronger formulation. Even with the weaker formulation, the argument works.
And if we want to be, if we want to be super technical, if one theory says there's Beth2 times as many people, I mean, you can't say it's Beth2 times as likely because you can't really multiply a cardinality by a real number in this way and like get a number between, like you can't multiply an infinite cardinality like this by a real number and get a real number, and your credences are supposed to be real numbers. So like if you want to be super technical,
reject the man. Don't have your credences be real numbers.
Yeah, I have a credence of Beth2 that there's Beth2 many people. Like it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, so okay, so SIA does imply analysis held equal. Does not mean that you should think hypotheses with more observers are more likely. Well, so if you think, so imagine you think there are Beth2 possible observers, and we can talk about the proof that it's at least Beth2 in a minute. But if there are Beth2 possible observers, if there are Beth2 possible observers, then on SIA, if you're randomly drawn from the pool of observers, then if there are any fewer than Beth2 people selected, then the odds of your existence are 0, right? So, if you have any version of SIA that where you think a big, like all the argument needs is you need at least the restricted version of the self-indication assumption where you reason as if you're selected from the share of possible people, and then reason to think that there are like a lot of possible people. Even if you don't think there are a lot of possible people, like even if it's only Aleph null, the argument's some evidence still, where it's like theism better predicts Aleph null people existing, particularly Aleph null people existing if they live for a long time. But anyways, yeah, so yeah, right. So the idea is just that if you think the cardinality of the possible people is a big cardinality, then your existence gives you reason to think there are a lot of people. Okay, right? So then even if the evidence was otherwise very against theism, if theism predicts way more observers than naturalism predicts Beth2 observers, and naturalism predicts with certainty only like Beth1 observers, then if your reasoning is if you're randomly selected from the share of possible observers, then you'll be certain of theism. I guess we could talk about the proof that there are Beth2 possible observers. The idea is just that, so there are continuum, so there are Beth1 many points in space, right? Where the points are just like, these things with these arbitrarily small bits of space. And then in space, you could take any arrangement of the points. You could take any subset of them, right? And so if you take any subset of points, then you get the power set of the number of points, which means you get, because it's a function over the points, which means you get at least Beth2 points. So as a result, there are at least Beth2 collections of points, and so there are at least Beth2 possible worlds. And so plausible lower bound. Okay, so I'll stress that SIA, or sorry, go ahead.
Another way you could do it is like if two different people have different heights across time, like you graph how tall somebody is across time. If two people have different height functions, then they're different persons, and you could plausibly get Beth2, or there are. It's well known that there are Beth2 real number, or like functions from real numbers to real numbers. But I think you could probably get make an argument like this, that there's like Beth2 functions that could serve as these functions talking about, like, say, somebody's height or somebody's weight across time. And so then that would guarantee the existence of at least Beth2 possible persons.
Right. Yeah. I mean, clearly the number of possible persons is at least, Beth2 is a very plausible lower bound. Even more undeniably is Beth1, even if you deny that there are points or something. Like, you could just take an infinitely big space and then take the number of subsets of it, which gets you Beth1. Like, it's very obvious that it's more than Aleph null. And so that requires more than a single universe. Okay. So then he says, I'll stress that the SIA, unlike the much more radical NSIA, does not imply that having more observers increases the probability of your specific existence if the pool of possible observers under consideration is proportionally larger. It only implies that when all else is equal. And this would include holding size, the pool of possible observers. More observers are more likely given that you exist. That was a confusing sentence.
I do find it sometimes harder to follow his writing style, which isn't like a critique of him. It's just like kind of admission that, hey, sorry, the way that you write isn't necessarily as close to the way that I think about things. So it might take a bit longer, or I might be more prone to misunderstanding you just because of these different styles.
Yeah. Wait, let's try reading the sentence again. It's a very long sentence. I'll stress that the SIA, unlike the much more radical NSIA, does not imply that having more observers increases the probability of your specific existence if the pool of possible observers under consideration is proportionately larger. It only implies that when all else is equal, and this would include holding equal the size of the pool of possible observers, more observers are more likely given that you exist. Well, so it's not just when all else is equal, more observers makes it more likely that you would exist. The idea is that a theory that predicts, like if a theory predicts 10 times as many observers, that explains your existence 10 times as well. It's not just like, well, that explains your existence a bit better. And this is something that is sort of like widely agreed to be part of SIA.
So when he says possible observers here, is he talking about existing people, or people who could exist and be observers? Like people who exist in, because I mean, if we talk about people who just exist in some possible world, the persons who count as possible is going to be invariant across all possible worlds. But if we're talking about like the actual observers, then yeah. So I'm confused by the sentence, right? Like the what counts as the pool of possible observers is necessary, right?
Right.
So yeah, of course we're holding that that equal across the two hypotheses, unless we're talking about in like a context where we're considering the USIA, but that's not what we're doing right now.
Okay. Yeah. I don't know. Truth Teller, I guess, if you're watching this, I'll explain what you mean. Okay. In fact, the problem is much worse. The standard SIA actually implies that the NSIA is false. This is because the reasoning, as if one is randomly selected from a set of all possible observers, would only lead one to update in favor of scenarios with more observers if it means a greater portion of observers than the total class of possible observers, which includes exists, which isn't the case when the total class is infinite. Why can't it be that if there's a bigger class of observers that exist out of an infinite, there's some important sense in which 5 is a greater share of infinity than
It does address
2.
that later, right?
Right.
I've managed to find those like little diagrams that I made if you want. I like them, but
yeah, you could go through them if you want.
Here, can I share? Oh yeah, this is how it goes. Hold on, it's giving me tips. It works best on a good computer or with 2 monitors. Well, I have neither, so.
Well, maybe not having either will sort of cancel out,
Yeah, negative times a negative and all that. Okay, you could see this?
No, but now I can.
Oh, okay. So here are the two ideas. One, the SIA, all other things equal, an observer should reason if randomly selected from the set of all possible observers. Or the NSIA, necessarily if a hypothesis H1 posits n times as many observers as H2, then upon updating on your existence, you ought to think H1 is n times more likely than H2. So, okay, for finite cases, I mean, something like the NSIA is just it depends on like when you say randomly selected, do we have like a kind of uniform distribution in mind and all that? So there's got to be some interpretive framework, but under you have to do some interpreting, but under a very plausible interpretation of the SIA, the NSIA is just entailed. I'm going to first show that this in finite cases, then in cases where there's like one of the H1 or H2, one of them says there's finitely many and the other says there's infinitely many people. And then finally, when both of them are talking about infinities, but one's of a different size. So firstly, like let's take this case. H1 says there are 3 people and H2 says there are 2 people. So the H1, or I labeled the possible, or like I labeled the observers that these hypotheses say exist as P1, P2, and P3, and then P4 and P5. So in this kind of toy setup, there's 5 possible people, and H1 says 3 of them exist. H2 says these other 2 exist over here. And now the idea is that when you update on the fact that you do exist, then you're going to the odds that of H1 to H2 are going to be 3 to 2. And that follows by saying, the very standard probability theory, the probability that you are P1, given that you find that you exist, plus the probability of that you are P2, given that you exist, so on and so forth, up to the probability that you are P5, given that you exist, that equals 1. And finally, the SIA tells you to treat yourself as any of those observers as being equally likely. You treat yourself, if the SIA is true, I can't say that there's a greater probability that I'm P5 or that I'm P1, given that I find myself to be existing absent other data, right? So they would all get the same probability, some K, like some real number K to represent the probability of all of these. And since they're all the same and they have to sum up to 1 and there are 5 terms, well, k is just going to be 1/5, right? And so the probability of H1, given that you exist, is going to be 0.6, and the probability of H2, given that you exist, is going to be 0.4. And so then the updating on your existence, you find that H1 is 1.5 times as likely, which is n in this case. So yeah, in finite cases, the NSIA seems to just follow straightforwardly from the SIA. I don't know if like Truth Teller has like a different interpretation of the SIA than us, but yeah, are you able to follow what I'm saying? Does this diagram make sense?
Yep.
Okay. In infinite, like now I'm going to change it slightly. So H1 says there is one person, P0, and H2 says there are Beth zero many people, right? Well,
right.
The SIA is still going to entail that all the people have to be like have the same probability, but we can't assign like a real number above 0, because otherwise that would diverge to infinity. So what we'd say is the probability that you are any specific person is going to be 0. An analogy would be like if I told you to pick a number between 3 and 4 completely randomly with a uniform distribution, the probability that the random number would be exactly pi is 0, right? Or if the prior probability of any number that you get exactly that number is going to be 0. So that's kind of what what the SIA entails. It would kind of have to be like that. Any specific person would get a prior probability of 0. What that means is that the H1, because it only has one person, it would get a probability of 0 conditional on your existence. And because these two, we're saying that these H1 and H2 are mutually exclusive and completely exhaustive of like the possibilities in this toy example. So then the probability of H2 would just have to be 1. Like I drew little dots here, like a blue dot representing the one person you could be given H1, and that blue dot's absent in H2, but like these are supposed to have like 0 area points. And so like it makes sense that when you update on like blue being correct, that you are an existing observer, then
Right.
yeah, you would think that your credence in H2 is infinitely bigger than your credence in H1, which okay, technically it's not like there is some n such that your credence in H1 times 0 is going to equal 1, because that's not how math works. Rather, it's just going to be like your credence in H2 given your existence is going to be 1, and your credence in H1 given your existence is going to be 0. And finally, it's like, well, what if we have like two infinities of different sizes? So H1 is Beth 0 people exist, and H2 is Beth 1 people exist. Well, we could actually subdivide Beth 1 into like Beth 1 and many subsets whose cardinality is Beth 0. So like one way of doing this, this illustration probably won't illustrate much, but like you could subdivide. Oh yeah, this could do it. So like say you have the real number line, and you want to you could subdivide it into like Beth 0 many chunks of intervals of size 1, right? Each interval will have Beth 1 many points in it, but it's like Beth 0 many Beth 1 points.
Yeah, I mean, and here's one way to see this, where it's just so between 1 and 2, there are an infinite number of numbers, right? And between 2 and 3, there are an infinite number of numbers. So the idea would just be that you can put 1 into 1-to-1 correspondence with all the, or into Beth 1-to-1 correspondence with all the numbers between 0 and 1. You can put 2 in 1-to-1 correspondence between all the infinitely many numbers between 1 and 2, etc.
Yeah. And I guess technically what I described is like breaking the real number line up into intervals like that is actually turning into Beth 0 many sets of size Beth 1. But you could do the other way around. You could have Beth 1 many sets of size Beth 0 by like having collecting them all into sets where their decimal expansions after the decimal point are all the same. And what that would give you is Beth 1 many sets of size Beth 0. Anyways, the point is that we could have like and what H2 is going to say Beth1 many people exist. And what we could do is like for H1, that's going to say like there's person 1 or person 2 or person 3, blah, blah, blah. That those are all going to be contained in H1. And we could basically make infinitely many rivals constructed out of people from H2. So in this little square in the bottom right, in the previous slide, each point represented a single person, but we could like just rearrange that so each point instead represents Beth0 numbers of people, like a group of Beth0 people, and Beth1 people contains infinitely many groups of Beth0 people. So there's going to be infinitely many sets of the same size as what H1 says when we consider the H2 space. So if I put some stuff in the little boxes in green, because there's an annoying complication where it's like, hey, what I'm trying to say is that for H1 is going to have the same probability as infinitely many subsets of H2. But what if you think it's not the same probability? So the idea is that just because there are all these subsets of H2 that have Beth0 or Beth1, or sorry, just because there are all these subsets with Beth1 many people in them, Beth0. I might just end it there because I'm not sure how many people are
right. Yeah, I feel like getting more into the weeds. It's like
yeah, okay. There's a really esoteric objection you could raise, and just trust me that the stuff I wrote in green is going to be just going to stop it.
The esoteric objection it's been debunked. It commits
by the little green boxes. But the point is that it seems that if we just reason through SIA, it's going to entail the NSIA.
Yeah. The esoteric objection, it relies on the false premise fallacy and the appeal to incredulity.
Yeah, the false premise fallacy. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, let's go back to a measured and comprehensive response. Okay, so so he illustrates this with this example about deck of cards.
I didn't understand that. Sorry.
Yeah, wait, okay, so, well, it's a simple analogy. So suppose you have a deck of cards where you know that within this deck is the ace of spades. There are 2 scenarios, and in each scenario, the deck of cards, I think maybe the point, well, let's just read it out and see if we understand it. Okay, so there are 2 scenarios, and in each scenario, the deck of cards is randomly shuffled. 1, you have a deck of 10 cards, and the ace of spades is there. You select a card at random. 2, you have a deck of cards, 52 cards, and you know the ace of spades is in that deck. Oh, I think his point is that what matters is what share of if you know that you are contained within the set of all possible people, it doesn't matter the size of the collection of possible people, as long as it selects you. Maybe that's the point.
But like then it would be like, I have the ace of spades. Okay.
Yeah.
Like, okay, sure.
Yeah. So but now, if we treat the cards as observers and reason as the SIA tells us to, you reason as if the ace of spades is a random sample, will likely to be any of the individual cards. Okay, yeah, I think that is the point. So then in scenario 1, there's a 1 in 10 chance. Yeah, right. So I guess, I mean, right. So Truth Teller seems to be suggesting what we call it the restricted self-indication assumption. We like to call it restricted self-indication assumption. And I think that view is implausible for the 3 reasons I gave before. It also has this additional kind of fatal problem where so imagine you're a necessitarian where you think everything that happens is necessary. Well, on the restricted self-indication assumption, that view does maximally well anthropically because it means every possible person exists, right? So if there's one theory that says that like Aleph null people exist, but there are more possible people, and the other one says, and the other one just is necessitarian and says there are 10 people, it seems like the self-indication assumption shouldn't favor the view on which there are 10 people.
But I don't think he's talking about the restricted self-indication assumption, because he goes on like to describe these like machines with like a contingent event of like random observer makers. So I don't think that's what he's getting at. And he's like saying like, now let's apply this analogy directly to this to an example involving observers. Suppose there are two random observer making machines, right?
I think maybe he's analogizing the collection of possible people to the possible outcomes of the machine, maybe to the like cards drawn.
I'm not sure.
I don't know.
I'm not sure what the ace is supposed to be as well.
I think you're the ace of spades.
So what happens if I don't select the ace of spades? What happens in those? So is that just me not existing?
Yeah, I think his idea is that what you get evidence for is that a larger share of the cards are drawn, because that makes it likelier that the ace of spades would be drawn, rather than there are more total cards, right? So the theory
so
says,
what does it mean to select? So what does it mean to select 4 cards, 3 of which aren't me? Is that like 4 people existing out of the 52?
Yeah, I think that's the analogy.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so he gives more analogies. Okay, I think we can.
Oh, wait, no. Can I talk about that one? Because like the machine making one, because I think that maybe this will if I go through it, like just fill it in a little bit more. It would help it. Maybe it would help truth tellers understand like why I would be struggling with this. So suppose there are 2 random observer making machines, M1 and M2. M1 is programmed to select among a class of 500 possible observers, among which you are one of them, and to select 100 of those observers to create them. M2 has a much larger class of possible observers it can create, 1 trillion, let's say, among which you are one of them. M2 selects 200 million of those observers to create at random, only one of which performs their only one of these machines performs their function. You learn that you exist and were created by one of these machines. Which machine should you think performed its function? So now here's a very important point. When it says that among which you are one of them, what does that mean? Does that mean that
I think like, you're one of the 1 trillion possible observers?
Yes, but what does that mean? How so when it says I'm one of them, let's say that it creates 100 observers. Sorry, it creates 500. There's 500 possible people it can make, and let's say 499 of them have a red shirt, and one of them has a blue shirt. Okay, the other can make 1 trillion possible observers. Right? Is that the number? I'm trying to find where in paragraph it says. Yeah, 100. Yeah, let's say it's 1 trillion, and one of them has a blue shirt. The rest are all red. So 999,999,999,000 red shirts and 1 blue shirt. And so when I find that I'm created, I would first, before looking at my shirt, I would think that M2 probably created me, because 200 million people is a large. Because of the SIA, I'd probably think machine 2 made me. But then if I look down and I see I have a red shirt, well, the first machine has a much is it instead of 500 possible observers, it's yeah. Once I learned that I have a blue shirt, instead of thinking I'm in part of M2, I would think I'm a part of M1, or like I was created by M1 rather than M2, because M1 has a higher chance of making a blue shirted person, even if it has a lower chance of making, or even if it doesn't make as many people. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think that the among which you are one of them, that's going to have to be some sort of a posteriori information, and that's going to be doing the heavy lifting here. So I'm having trouble separating like what's actually doing the sharing, the share portion, and what's doing the just numbers, because like it seems to me in terms of Anthropic data, the amount of people still matters.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that's important is that what matters is the number of observers that you currently might be. Right, so SIA doesn't tell you to think there are a bunch of like frogs on faraway planets. just on the
Yeah.
grounds that makes it likelier. Right. The idea is that you think more people you currently might be. Right. So, and it's very hard to make sense of this case, but if the idea is that both theories mean that you exist, well, SIA won't. If you know, like, suppose every person's given a number, okay, given a random irrational number, and you're given the number pi, let's say. Like, if both theories predict that the number pi, the person with the number pi gets created, you'll be indifferent between those because they mean an equal number of people who you, based on your current evidence, might be. It's just that if there are multiple possible people who you might be, then you should do indifference reasoning upon them.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I think I might have gotten it wrong because he says there's a 20% chance that you were created from M1. So I guess that means there's 100 observers that I could be. So like 100 people with blue shirts. I'm not sure. I'm sorry, truth teller, if because I understand, but I don't understand what you're saying.
Yeah, sorry, and I don't want to be a dick, but like this is kind of one of the reasons why I was reluctant to write a 120-page reply. Or a reply to this like 120 pages thing, where it's just like a lot of it's very unclear and it's hard to know what's being said. And so it is, and it's sort of like there's something frustrating. Like each time, something's unclear, you have to work through to like figure out what it's saying. And there's something just very frustrating about like 100 pages of just unclarity, which, I mean, and it's a complicated topic. I'm sure lots of the things I said were unclear in lots of ways, but yeah, it still is
and two things. One, I know I've been unclear in this stream, like very recently as well, but also throughout I did skim the article, and I know that throughout it truth teller will say I don't buy Matthew's point here. I don't think his objection to what I said works, but I could have been more clear in what I said. So kudos to truth teller. He is he does like recognize, okay, yeah, I do see I could have been more clear here. Also, something I like about what truth teller does, whenever he uses pronouns that refer to God, he capitalizes them, which I always appreciate that.
Nice. Yeah. Wait, okay, let me see if I can make sense of them. Okay, so M1 means that there are 500 possible observers, you're one of them, and 100 of them get created. M2 means there are 1 trillion observers and you're one of them and 200 million. Right, okay, so then I think, right, so the idea is that that's analogous to SIA, where it's just like what matters is the share of possible observers. Again, as I've explained, I think there are a lot of different reasons, especially the Elga reason in particular, which Elga defends in his first paper on the topic. That one in particular is especially a reason to accept what I call the unrestricted SIA. But again, the argument, it does not hinge on the unrestricted SIA. It's perfectly compatible with restricted SIA.
Yeah, but what I think is going on with this analogy is that he's trying to show like it's not the number of people that matters as much as the proportions when it comes to anthropic data. But when you actually spell out this thought experiment he gives, the number of people is what's relevant to the anthropic data, and this other data that he puts in there, among which you are one of them, that's actually some a posteriori data that we're going to be getting that then that we have to reconditionalize on after we conditionalize on the like, oh, I have a blue shirt, not a red shirt. That's why so because if you didn't actually get that information, if we didn't have the among which you are what you are, like this specific one, the blue shirted one, if it was just they were all indistinguishable red shirters and you found yourself with a red shirt, then yeah, the only thing that would matter would be the number of people.
Yeah. Okay, so then truth teller says, okay, so he addresses this case for SIA. I agree this case, it's a case for SIA, but it's not a case specifically for the unrestricted SIA. So Joe Carlsmith gives this case where it's called Save the Puppy. So you wake up in a red jacket, in front of you is a puppy, next to you is a button that will create 1 trillion more people, all wearing blue jackets. No one else exists. A giant boulder is rolling inexorably toward the puppy and will crush the puppy with very high probability. You want to save the puppy, but you can't reach it. But if you accept SSA and you understand the power of reference classes, so you make a firm commitment. If the boulder doesn't swerve away from the puppy, you will press the button. Otherwise, you don't. Should you expect the boulder to swerve? The idea is if you reason as if you're randomly selected from the possible people, then it's super unlikely the boulder will hit it, because then that means that you're you happen to be the only guy in the red shirt, which is super unlikely. So that right, but so now
like
as I argue in a post, this view doesn't just apply to SSA; it applies to any alternative to SIA. Right. So let's imagine you don't know that you're the first person, and then you learn that you're the first person. Well, after learning that you're the first person, so imagine same case, but first you didn't know that you were the first person, and then you find out that you're the first person. Well, if you're going to press the button, then it's very unlikely that you'd be the first person, right? Because the odds, if there are a lot of people, the odds of you being the first person are like 1 in a trillion, right? Because you could have been any of the people. So now you're very certain that the button won't be pressed. So now you can make whatever you want happen by just agreeing to press the button unless the thing you want happens. But so Truth Teller says it doesn't, points out correctly, it doesn't require committing to the NSIA, and that it doesn't require doesn't require the SSA, which, yeah, sure. I agree that it doesn't require the SSA, or well, so I think it applies to every view other than SIA, but it doesn't differentiate between the different SIA views. But I mean, Truth Teller is making a big deal of this, but this is all irrelevant. If you accept the NSIA, then well, first of all, I don't think you should accept it for the kind of two reasons. The two main reasons you shouldn't accept it are: one, it implies that necessitarianism is the best view anthropically, which is very implausible, and two, the Elgar reasoning rules it out. Now, Truth Teller says, well, okay, he's talking a lot about this, but remember, I think, and I could be wrong about this, but it seems like he thinks that the case for there being Beth two people in some way hinges on the unrestricted self-indication assumption, which absolutely does not. Once you think, based on the arguments I've given, that there are at least Beth two possible people, the argument works just fine on the restricted self-indication assumption. So, yeah. Okay, so then Truth Teller says, or sorry, do you have anything to add? Apologetics squared. By the way,
well,
how long can you do this for? Because I realize it's taking a while, which is maybe not.
I have about 10 more minutes, so we've almost made a third of the quarter. I don't know. We've almost made a chunk in this article. Yeah, I just think that the NSIA is entailed by the SIA in its most plausible reading. I don't know how Truth Teller could like differentiate, like maintain the SIA without maintaining a very strong form of the NSIA.
Yeah.
Why is it plainly false?
Would you be down to do a part 2 at some point? Or
sure, but we're already. I mean, there's going to be if Truth Teller does decide to respond to this. I mean, I'm pretty sure it will be longer than the portion we've managed to respond to yet. So I'm worried about backlog considerations.
I think if Truth Teller makes a response to this, I'd be happy to debate him about this, but I would not make a response. Like if he writes a 1,000-page treatise about responding to it, I will not respond.
I mean, okay, maybe an interesting idea. I just throwing this out here. Wasn't it Josh Rasmussen and somebody else? They I can't remember who it was. I think it was Philippe Leon or somebody. They just had letters back and forth about various philosophy of religion things, and they just turned it into a book. I mean, at this point, that seems like a pretty plausible thing you can do. Just if y'all keep responding back and forth on the anthropic argument, you just put all the posts in one document, and boom, you've got a book.
I don't know. I don't think it's quite book material because, like, I don't cite things in the proper way, and also I don't know that would require me responding to Truth Teller. It would just be a massive pain.
Yeah. Maybe. Yeah. I'm thinking. I guess like before I leave, maybe we could talk about like how to go forward, because this is these y'all both have been doing some pretty good, thorough, point-by-point refutations, but it's getting a little unwieldy. What's a good way forward? Maybe there's a way to focus on distilling like the main disagreements y'all have or something.
We could do a rap battle.
A rap battle, yes. I think that would be pretty good.
We could, like the Kendrick and Drake beef, where like I would call Truth Teller a pedophile with no evidence. I think that would be really, really effective. I don't know. I mean, I think one more point by point response is worth it. Finishing up responding to this, but then beyond that, and having a debate obviously is something I'd like to do, which Truth Teller might do at some point, but he's reluctant to do in the short term.
And which I totally like. I empathize with that because I feel like when I prepare a response, it's better than off the cuff. Speaking off the cuff, like I'm probably said something that didn't come across right. I don't want to come across as rude to Truth Teller at all, but I worry that maybe I did say something that came across as rude because I'm speaking off the cuff, which I don't want to do. And so I get the reluctance to do like I understand the preference to written dialogues.
Yeah, but I also think there's something valuable about oral debates, particularly if it's a dispute that's so long that no one in their right mind is going to like read through it and watch all the videos.
I think that what it also does is it the sort of back and forth it allows you to like clarify confusions and like misgivings really quickly. It's like instead of like saying there's 3 possible ways to interpret this, here's my response to interpretation 1, interpretation 2, and interpretation 3. You could just as soon as they make a claim, you could say, wait, hold on, what do you mean by that? And then the conversation can progress. So it's like a lot. That's one reason why conversations in person or like on video calls like this end up being shorter.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, should we keep going through it, or
you can if you want. I'm probably gonna have to get going here.
Okay, yeah, I think maybe I'll wrap up. We could do a part 2 if you'd be down.
I've always
and a part 3 and a part 4 until we finish.
I enjoy like part Beth 1. Sorry. Again, like the length of this, by the way, I want to emphasize, it's not a criticism of Truth Teller.
Yeah, no, it's impressive, It's
I'm
like he wrote like basically a book. Like it's like 120 pages.
All sorts of like whatever problem you have with Truth Teller, you cannot deny that he exemplifies the virtue of thoroughness. Like
yes,
yeah, good on you. But yeah, I forgot what I was saying. Sorry. Before that.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess we'll wrap up now. We're leaving off at in sum, BB is wrong, which I guess I'll text you. I mean, and that's a good summation. In
some BB is wrong.
Okay. Yep. Yeah. Anyways, thanks for coming on, Mr. Square, and thanks for watching, everyone. Thanks for bearing through with this like incredibly boring and tedious topic where we like talked about the minutiae of set theory. I'm impressed that so many of you are still watching, which confirms that I have not just a very smart audience, but also that you're all very handsome, and etc.
The people like you're popular, have many friends.
Right. That you have, you're probably all like really tall and like physically strong, skilled at basketball. Yeah. Okay.
Anyways, bye.
All right. Bye.